Welcome back to Judgment and Decision Making. I'm Dr. Padilla. Now we're going to talk about politics and political orientations. In this section, we'll focus on three issues. The first is, do political orientations tend to be internally consistent? Spoiler, yes. Do such consistent orientations arise from deep, implicit factors with remarkably little to do with the specific political issue? Yes. And finally, can one begin to detect bits of biology underlying these factors? Based on the topic of this book, we will say, of course. Now, we'll first start with this concept of internal consistency of political orientation. Social, economic, environmental, and international political orientations tend to come in one package, which is illustrated nicely by this cartoon where this woman is asking, does this dress make me look Republican? And that's to say that you can look Republican because maybe Republicans dress a certain way. That's kind of the premise of this particular cartoon. Political ideology is merely one manifestation of a broader ideological persuasion. So the way you think about politics just represents the way that you think about the world, really. If political ideology is one manifestation of a larger ideology, are there physiological, affective, cognitive, and visceral ways in which leftists and rightists tend to differ? That's the question here. First, let's look at intellectual style. In one study, conservatives and liberals were asked about the cases of poverty. Both tended towards personal attributions. They would say they are poor because they are lazy. They would ascribe some attribute towards a person to describe why they were in poverty. But that was only if they were forced to make a snap type 1 decision-making process. When given more time, liberals were more likely to shift towards situational explanations, such as, wait, things might be stacked against a poor person. Well, in those cases, with a certain amount of time, liberals were more likely to activate type 2 processing and maybe make a different choice rather than their initial snap decision. These findings suggest that it's easier to make a liberal think like a conservative than the other way around. If you really do anything mentally taxing with a liberal, they become more conservative in the way they make decisions. So people become more conservative when they're tired, in pain, or distracted, when the blood alcohol levels are high, or during high working memory demand. Remember, working memory demand is when you're actively working hard to do a mental process. So if you are thinking deeply about a problem and then you're asked another question, you're more likely to respond to that secondary question as a conservative because you have less mental energy to associate to that secondary task. According to one author, there's 6 foundations of morality. The first is care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, liberty versus oppression, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation. Now, before I go on, in your mind, I want you to think of what are your top 3 moral convictions. Which of these items do you think are most important to you morally? Now, if you're a liberal, you're likely to say the first 3, care, fairness, and liberty might be the most important to you. And research finds that if you're more right-leaning, you're going to think the last 3 would be more important: loyalty, authority, and sanctity. Now, focusing on individuals that are right-leaning, they tend to have a stronger need for closure. They dislike novelty, are more comfortable with structure and hierarchy, or more readily perceive circumstances as threatening, are more religious in their empathy, meaning that when they do have empathetic leanings, they tend to come from religious foundations. And all of these are based on empirical research that is done on a very large scale with thousands of people in these studies. So individually, each person might vary a little bit, but if you look at a large population of people, individuals that tend to be right-leaning also tend to have these characteristics. One characterizing quote is, "Best days as behind us and familiar circumstances that should be returned to make things great again." So they tend to be very comfortable with things that happened in the past, that they are familiar, that they know about, and they're more nervous about how things change in the future. There's multiple demonstrations of this in apolitical contexts, such as response to optical illusions and taste in entertainment. For example, authoritarian conservatives, but not liberals, respond more rapidly to threatening words like cancer, snake, mugger, than to non-threatening words. Republicans report 3 times as many nightmares as do Democrats, particularly ones involving the loss of power. That's to say that they have a strong response to things being threatening. They see neutral stimuli and they interpret it as threatening. They have a very strong fear response in believing that things are threatening to them. When you stick subjects in a room with a smelly garbage can, they are more likely to become socially conservative. So the sensation of disgust is related to socially conservative persuasions. Social conservatives tend towards lowering thresholds for disgust than liberals, meaning that they have a stronger guttural reaction to things that are disgusting. And in one study, subjects were exposed to either positively or negatively charged emotional words, and the galvanic skin response, this is sort of our autonomic nervous system response to sweat in our palms, that tended to be more reactive towards the negatively charged words than the positively charged words. The biggest autonomic response to negative but not positive emotional words were for conservatives that were opposed to gay marriage or premarital sex. So those that were very right-leaning had the strongest physiological reaction towards negative information. And I like to bring this up. The woman who posted this is the most conservative person I know, and that person tends to post lots of things where she suggests they are sickening or gross or violating or nasty. Those are the types of words. And it's not just that this individual likes to use that terminology. They may actually be getting more physically sick in response to information that they find threatening or that they don't like. So it's not to say that we all have the same physiological responses. Based on our judgments and behavior, we might have different physiological responses to the same information. In addition, conservatives are more likely to think that disgust is a good metric for deciding whether something is moral or not. This is a quote by Leon Kass in The Wisdom of Repugnance. It's a book that he wrote, where disgust at something like human cloning can be an emotional expression of deep wisdom, beyond wisdom's power to completely articulate it, suggesting that we have some type of internal wisdom and our gross response is our internal, DNA telling us that something is bad. There's a lot of flaws to that particular reasoning. One is that different things disgust different people.
That ain't long legs. Ew. Jelly donuts. Ew. Will Ferrell. Ew. Kid. Rella? Yeah. He's like a total hottie. I can't. Then don't. Seriously, don't. I must.
All right. Another issue is that things once viewed as disgusting are viewed differently now. Things like face tattoos, colored hair, gay marriage, all those things are pretty much accepted now. And in the past, they were viewed as very disgusting. People might have had visceral responses to that, but that has changed since then. So disgust is a moving target. Okay, summary. Political orientations tend to be internally consistent. Orientations arise from deep implicit factors with remarkably little to do with the political issues that they're associated with. Issues anchored in the insula, which is the disgust center in the brain, the insula, help explain differences in some of these political orientations. And people become more conservative when they're tired, in pain, distracted, when blood alcohol levels arise, or during high working memory demand.